Debbie Erdens claims that her husband's death led her to a new phase of assurance and faith in God. That explains the title, okay, what her words are coming. And she said, God used the death of my husband, my beloved husband, as Oswald Chambers said, piercing a hole in the darkness so that I could behold the face of God. I am a changed woman. Wow. Here is the message of the book of Job. God can use the darkest moments in our lives to pierce a hole in the darkness. Job's complaints against God. We heard last week much of Job's complaints. The injustice in the world, injustice in his life, the governance in the world. He doesn't agree with how God is governing the world. Defending his innocence and his uprightness, Job declares that God has no good reason for permitting the evil that befell him. Has anybody in this room ever complained to God? No need to show hands, okay? Sometimes our complaining is just, and it can be just, and sometimes it is not. There's a scene in the movie Bruce Almighty, in which the character played by Jim Carrey is complaining that God is making him late from work because of the traffic. As he voices his bitterness, unreal complaining, okay? As he voices his bitterness, he is ignorant of the pain of a person on the stretcher in the background, real victim of the accident. What good does complaining? Does it help us clear the air? Does it lower our blood pressure? Do we expect anything to come of our complaining? Did Job? Probably not. In his darkest hour, Job cried out to God, and to his surprise, God answered him. God's counter questions. Job has been questioning God, now he questions. And before God's entry, okay? Few years ago, Hollywood director was making a film attempting to cover the story of the Bible. In his stage direction, he wrote, "Enter God, begin with an earthquake, and work up to a climax." You have got to admire that director's vision. God often makes an entry, grand entrance. Today's reading, how does God enter? A whirlwind, a hurricane comes. Sometime earthquake would come, God enters. We those who watch the movie, the Chosen, at the beginning, what is shown there? God, 10 Commandments and the mountain, the cracking, the 10 Commandments being written. So, and that's just God's way. How does God enter the story? Well, I mentioned that. Whirlwind. And in fact, in today's reading, counter questions. There are 12 to 13 questions that God raises. God asks Job. And there are more questions in the next chapter 39. So a lot of questions. Anyone who argues with God must respond. That's what God is asking, questions. Come on. Nancy is okay. What is God telling Job and us in these questions? Job is confident in the fact that he will see God one day. He says in chapter 19, he says, I know my Redeemer lives, and I'll see him one day. On his judgment day, he believes he will see God Almighty. Then he will know the mind of God. But Job never expects God to answer him while he was still living. And yet God does explain the reason for Job's suffering. But does he? No, he does not. God does not tell the reason why Job is suffering. God reminds Job of what? Who is the creator and who is the created one? He asks him, where were you when the foundation of the world were laid? And all different questions. Can humans judge God's action? Can we question his way of governing the world? Paul Smith writes in his book, God's Plan for Our Good. This is what he writes. Very good question, a point he raises. There is a problem with standing in judgment of God. We judge God. He himself is the standard by which all things are judged. We do not know good apart from God. His actions are the very definition of good. To complain that God has done something that he ought not have done is rather like complaining that the sun came out late today to start the day. The day is defined by the rising of the sun. Even as good is defined by the action of God. And it is Paul Smith who raises a question. Where could we find another standard by which to judge the actions of God? To presume that we can judge God is to place ourselves over God. The Catholic priest one time speaking, his name is Frank Sheed. Frank Sheed. He was speaking about God's governing the world and God's majesty and how God rules over the creation. A heckler in the crowd shouted, I could make a better universe than your God. Sheed replied, I won't ask you to make a universe, but could you make a rabbit just to establish confidence? God makes a lot of questions in the Bible. Not only Job, he's asking questions, he asked questions from Eve. What have you done? He asked Adam and Eve both, where are you? He asked Ezekiel, can these dry bones come to life? He asks his disciples, what do people say? Who do people say that I am? A lot of questions. Peter, do you love me? A lot of questions God asks. And Job is here being asked, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? God is the creator of the universe, the author of all life. Doesn't he have all the answers? Does God have all the answers as a creator? Yes, he knows what he has created, why he has created, what's the purpose of creation or each thing he created. He has the answers. He knows. He's the planner. Why is he asking all these questions? I think, now this is the line to catch. I think God is raising these questions so that we might think deeply of our choices, of our responsibilities, and of our beliefs. Isn't this what God is saying to Job? That think. Isn't this what God is asking Job? Could you make a better universe than I? Do you understand the great care, the order, complexity that abound in creation? Do you have the power to control wind and wave and the planet? Do you provide a balanced ecosystem to each one of your beloved creatures, even the most weak and the finite ones? And finally, do you understand every thought and emotion that has ever entered the human spirit, a human heart? My question to you folks, if God asked you one of these questions about the universe, what would be your reply? Do you understand the winds? Can you order the clouds? Come, rain, please put down the rain. What would be your reply? If you answered yes, well, I don't want to, I'll guess. If you answered yes to any of these questions, then sorry to say, because you are lying. You don't know the answer. No human being can even begin to comprehend the mind of God. That is what God revealed to Isaiah. Remember the famous, your thoughts are not my thoughts are higher than your thoughts, nor is your thinking my thinking, nor are your ways my ways. The east is away from the west, so are our thoughts, and your thoughts, my thoughts, away from each other. Yes. St. Augustine has said two things of St. Augustine I love. He said, to know God, you have to be God. And he says, if you think you know God, that is not my God. Because God is unknowable. We cannot know God. God only knows, next point, God only knows and is in control of what God does. So, question is God being cruel by challenging Job's knowledge in this way? No. Because we can truly learn something. We must realize that we are ignorant. We don't know a lot of things. Job thought he knew God. He knew God's modus operandi, God's way of doing things. He knew it. No, he did not. He thought he had the rules of the universe memorized and calculated. Before God could get through to Job, God had to remind Job of all he did not know, how the universe runs. Doesn't it? It reminds me of Psalm 46, verse 10, famous one. Be still. This is what God is telling Job through all this questioning. Be still. Can you complete the verse? And know that I am God. You are not. A story of a wise man who attained a reputation of spiritual maturity. Here is a spiritual maturity in his words, okay? He was asked by one of his disciples to describe how his thinking has changed along the spiritual journey. Slowly, progression. Taking pen and paper, the wise man wrote, watch it, I know. Then he added the line, I may not know. And then another line, I do not know. And then, I would like to know. Then, I will try to know. I would like to know, I would try to know. And finally he wrote, I know. Comes to my mind a long time, seminary training time, one sentence that I learned. I know that I do not know. Yes, that's the wisdom in it. What did Job know before the moment in his life, before this moment, before God speaking? He knew that he was in pain. He knew that he had spent his life trying to honor God. What did Job know after this moment that God spoke to him? He knew that God is God. God is sovereign, ultimate, all-powerful, all-knowing, holy, holy, holy. Though he cannot explain God, most of us say that what Christopher Morley has said, I had 1,000 questions to ask God, but when I met him, they all fled and did not seem to matter. This is the assurance now Job has gotten. He attempted, assurance he has found in God. He is not shut out of God's grace. Assurance he has received. And mercy after all. God knows him. God hears his prayer. God has a plan for his universe and all created thing. God is and God knows. And in this, Job finds what he is looking for. King Larry used to interview people. We know that in his book, Powerful Prayers, King Larry, he puts one actor, Kirk Douglas's prayer, or his words, his sharing words, very, very interesting. A poor, blind person is poor, he is blind, and he is childless. He is praying at the Wailing Wall of Jerusalem for some good fortune from God. Imagine his surprise when God spoke to him and offered to fulfill one of his prayers, one prayer he can make, okay? So tell me, what should the man pray for? He is poor, he is blind, he is childless. Watch his prayer, very intelligent. He could pray for wealth, but he had no children to pass it on to. He could pray that for sight, but then he would be able to see his misery. He could pray for children, but he was too poor to support them. Suddenly the man knew what to do. He bowed his head and fervently prayed. And in his prayer, all three things are asked God, okay? Dear God, grant me just one thing, the joy of seeing my children eating of gold plates. Riches, he asks. He asks for a vision to see his children, and he asks for them eating the riches, the wealth. Job had no such answer to give. When God asked, where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? Job is forced to acknowledge that God's ways are beyond his understanding. And he is left with a choice all of us must make. And that is what? Acknowledgement, we do not know, God. Your ways are higher than our ways. We must trust God. We must trust God. And next week's reading, which I'll say a word, is in humility, submit to God's plans. Humility. That's all I wanted to share. Thank you. Oh, one verse I wrote here. I wrote a poetry in my college days, seminary days, and one verse I wrote came to my mind when I was preparing the sermon, and that is, the universe would have passed away long since long if a human being had been God. Thank you. Appreciate it. All right, next we move on to our invitation for offertory. For Jesus, a life lived for others was the only life consistent with God's